Deep in the heart of the snow-capped Altai Mountains, nestled in a valley forgotten by time, stands the monastery of Seraphim's Rest. For centuries, travelers have spoken of it only in whispers, a place shrouded in mist and legend, but within its silent, crumbling walls lies a secret that could rewrite history itself, a chronicle sealed for 1,000 years, detailing the last days of a magnificent empire and the cataclysm that brought it to its knees. Today, we journey into the heart of this mystery to uncover the truth behind the fall of the Aethelene Empire. Our story begins not with kings or warriors, but with a humble historian named Dr. Alistair Finch. For 20 years, Finch had dedicated his life to studying a civilization renowned for their breathtaking architecture, advanced understanding of astronomy, and a society built on principles of balance and harmony. They were a beacon of progress in the ancient world. And then, in the blink of an eye, they vanished. No records of a war, no signs of a plague, just silence. The once thriving heart of their empire, the city of Solara, became a ghost town. Its golden spires swallowed by the earth. Finch, like many before him, was stumped. The official histories spoke of a gradual decline, of economic collapse and internal strife, but the evidence didn't add up. The Aethelene cities were abandoned so abruptly that loaves of bread were left half-eaten in ovens, and children's toys lay scattered in the streets. It was as if every single person had simply disappeared in a single moment. Finch's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A tattered, half-burnt merchant's logbook he discovered in a dusty archive in Istanbul. The log mentioned a skyfire and a song of the earth that shook the world. It spoke of panicked refugees fleeing eastward towards the mountains, seeking refuge at a sanctuary known as Seraphim's Rest, a place supposedly built by the Aethelians themselves as a library of last resort. Fueled by this clue, Finch mounted an expedition. The journey was grueling. The Altai Mountains are unforgiving, their peaks piercing the clouds, their valleys swept by brutal winds. After weeks of trekking through treacherous terrain, guided only by the merchant's vague descriptions, they found Italiano. Tucked away in a high, secluded valley, almost invisible against the rock face, was the monastery. It was more a fortress than a place of worship. Its walls were built from a strange, obsidian-like stone that seemed to absorb the light, and its gates were sealed not with wood or iron, but with a complex series of interlocking stone gears. It was clear this place was built to withstand the end of the world. After days of careful work, Finch and his team managed to unlock the ancient mechanism. The great stone doors groaned open, releasing a gust of stale, 1,000-year-old air. The interior was a marvel. The central chamber was a vast, circular library. Shelves carved directly into the stone walls stretched up into the darkness, lined with countless scrolls and codices. But at the very center of the room, on a solitary pedestal, lay a single, enormous book. It was bound in what looked like hammered bronze, inlaid with lapis lazuli and obsidian. A complex lock, made of concentric rings covered in Aethelene script, held it shut. This was it, the Chronicle of the final day. The script on the lock was a riddle, an astronomical puzzle that took Finch and his team another week to solve. It required aligning the rings to a specific celestial configuration, the exact position of the stars and planets on the day Solara fell. When the final ring clicked into place, the lock sprang open. With trembling hands, Finch opened the cover. The pages were not paper or vellum, but thin, flexible sheets of hammered gold, inscribed with the elegant, flowing script of the author was a man named Lyran, the high astronomer of Solara and the keeper of the city's chronometers. His words, written with a steady, deliberate hand, painted a picture not of societal collapse, but of an unimaginable cosmic event. Lyran wrote that for decades, the Aetheline astronomers had been tracking a celestial anomaly, a shadow wanderer, as they called it. It was a rogue object, a dense cluster of asteroids and cometary ice, on a collision course with their solar system. They calculated its trajectory with terrifying precision. They knew, down to the day, when it would arrive. The Aethelians, a society that prided itself on logic and preparation, did not panic. Instead, they began the largest undertaking in their history, a mass exodus. But they weren't planning to flee across the land. They were planning to go up. The Chronicle revealed the Aethelians' greatest secret, They had mastered a form of gravitational technology, powered by massive geothermal vents deep beneath their capital city. For years, they had been secretly constructing a fleet of enormous arcs, city-sized vessels designed to carry their entire population to the stars, to a new home they had identified in a neighboring star system. The fall of the Aethelene Empire wasn't a fall at all. It was a departure. The abandoned cities, the half-eaten mealsit, was all because, on a single, designated day, the entire civilization boarded these ships and left Earth behind. The plan was almost perfect. But Lyran's account takes a tragic turn in its final pages. He was one of a handful of volunteers who stayed behind in the fortified monastery of Seraphim's Rest to document the event and ensure their story would not be lost forever. He was to be the final witness. His last entry describes the day of the Exodus. He watched from an observatory dome as the arcs, gleaming silver in the sun, rose silently from hidden launch sites across the empire and ascended into the heavens. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to their ingenuity and spirit. But as the last arc cleared the atmosphere, the unthinkable happened. The shadow wanderer they had tracked for so long was not a simple asteroid cluster. As it entered the solar system, its gravitational pull tore a larger, unforeseen object. From the outer asteroid, belt a colossal, iron-rich planetoid. This new threat was faster, larger, and on a direct collision course with Earth. The Aethelians had planned for one catastrophe, but were now faced with another, entirely unpredictable one. Loran's final, frantic entry is chilling. He writes of the sky turning a fiery red, of the ground shaking so violently that the mountains themselves seemed to cry out. This was the skyfire and the song of the earth from the merchant Eslog. It wasn't the Aethelians' technology, it was the impact of the planetoid. The cataclysm was far greater than anything they had anticipated. It triggered a global extinction event, wiping the slate of history clean and burying the ruins of their world under miles of dust and rock. Lyran's last words, scratched hastily onto the final golden page, are a message of both hope and sorrow. They have escaped the fire of our world, but have they escaped the shadow that follows? We leave this record as a warning. The heavens are vast and unpredictable. Look to the stars, but never forget the ground beneath your feet and weedy, that the Chronicle ends. The Aethelene Empire didn't fall. It ascended. They saved themselves, but the world they left behind was irrevocably shattered, leading to a dark age that reset human civilization. The secrets of Seraphim's Rest have given us an entirely new understanding of our own ancient past. It shows us that history is not always what it seems, and that sometimes the most incredible legends are rooted in an even more incredible truth. What other secrets are buried beneath our feet, waiting to be rediscovered? Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the past. If you enjoyed this exploration, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries. We'll see you next time. Brother Matthew's final words lingered in the cold chamber, like the fading echo of a bell long after it had been struck. Elias Verne stared at the iron-bound chest, feeling an unease that reason alone could not dismiss. If the Chronicle truly carried a warning meant for the future, then the monks of St. Armand had spent centuries guarding not merely a relic, but a message meant to reach someone willing to listen. For a moment, neither man moved. The lantern flame trembled in the stale air, painting the chamber walls with restless shadows that seemed almost alive. Elias finally asked the question that had been growing within him since the story began. If the Chronicle warned that the catastrophe was never contained, why allow it to be read now? Brother Matthew answered slowly, as though each word required permission from memories he had tried for decades to silence. Because signs have begun to appear again. He explained that during the last 10 years, several scholars traveling across distant regions had independently reported discovering fragments of strange symbols carved into ruins that should never have contained such markings. These symbols matched those described within the Forbidden Chronicle. At first, the monks believed the reports were coincidence or scholarly imagination. Yet the discoveries continued, appearing in places separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history. It was as if the same ancient language had begun quietly resurfacing beneath the surface of the modern world. Elias listened carefully, though skepticism still clung to him like a stubborn shadow. Ancient symbols were often rediscovered in scattered ruins. Archaeology itself was built upon such coincidences. But Brother Matthew shook his head with a weary certainty. These were not scattered relics. They followed a pattern. Every new discovery appeared along a line that traced the forgotten empire's final borders, as though something buried beneath the old territories was slowly awakening once more. The old monk lifted the chest's iron latch with a sound that echoed sharply through the chamber. He hesitated before opening it, his hand lingering on the lid, as though remembering the weight of every oath sworn by the monks before him. Then at last he raised it. Inside lay a single manuscript bound in dark leather, so worn that its original color had long ago surrendered to time. The edges of its pages were blackened slightly, not by fire but by a strange discoloration that resembled ink spilled centuries earlier and slowly absorbed by the parchment itself. Elias felt a quiet tremor in his chest as he reached toward the book. The Chronicle was heavier than he expected, its pages thick and uneven as if they had been written in haste during the final days of a collapsing world. The script itself was precise and elegant, the handwriting of a man who had once believed his words would survive forever. According to the opening lines, the Chronicle had been written by the final imperial archivist of the unnamed empire, a scholar named Cassian Thorne. Cassian described himself not as a historian but as a witness, condemned to record the final days of a civilization that had uncovered a truth too terrible to ignore. Elias began reading aloud, his voice echoing softly through the stone chamber. The Chronicle described how the empire's scholars eventually deciphered the ancient warning carved throughout the buried halls. The message, repeated across hundreds of chambers, spoke of a presence sealed beneath the earth by a civilization far older than the empire itself. That civilization had not vanished through war or disease. It had vanished after sacrificing everything to imprison what the warning called the listener in the deep. The name alone carried a strange weight within the text. The listener in the deep was never described as a creature or a god. Instead, the ancient carvings referred to it as an awareness, something capable of hearing the thoughts and voices of those who wandered too close to its prison. According to the translated warning, the ancient civilization discovered that the listener possessed a terrible influence. It did not simply destroy those who encountered it. It whispered. It planted ideas within the minds of explorers, suggestions that slowly grew into obsessions. Entire communities had once descended into madness after hearing those whispers echo through underground chambers. The ancient civilization eventually realized that knowledge of the listener itself strengthened its reach. The more people who learned about its existence, the louder its whispers became. For that reason, the ancient builders constructed the underground halls, not as temples or cities, but as a labyrinth designed to bury the prison so deeply that future generations would never discover it. Yet centuries later, the empire's excavations shattered that careful design. Cassian Thorne wrote that the first scholars who studied the symbols began experiencing strange dreams. At first the dreams seemed harmless, simple visions of endless corridors and distant echoes. But gradually the dreams grew more vivid. Scholars awoke, claiming they had heard a voice speaking gently in the darkness of their sleep. The voice never demanded anything directly. Instead, it asked questions. Questions about curiosity. Questions about knowledge hidden beneath the earth. Questions about how far the human mind was willing to go in pursuit of truth. Elias paused while reading, noticing a faint tension creeping into his own thoughts, as though the Chronicle's words carried an unsettling rhythm. Brother Matthew watched him carefully, but said nothing. The Chronicle continued describing how several scholars became obsessed with returning to the sealed chambers, despite royal orders forbidding further exploration. They argued that the ancient warning had been misunderstood. Perhaps the buried civilization had feared knowledge itself, rather than any real danger. Perhaps the listener was merely a metaphor misunderstood by primitive translators. Within months, secret expeditions began descending into the forbidden tunnels at night. Cassian Thorne recorded their conversations, noting how their curiosity gradually transformed into something colder and more determined. They began speaking about the listener as though it were waiting patiently for them to understand it. The archivist himself confessed that he too began hearing faint whispers while working alone in the Imperial Library. At first the voice sounded like distant wind passing through narrow corridors, but one night it spoke clearly enough for him to recognize the words. It asked a simple question. What if the prison was never meant to hold something evil? What if it was meant to keep humanity away from a truth it was not ready to hear? Elias felt a chill move slowly down his spine as he read that line aloud. The lantern flame flickered again, though no draft stirred the air. Cassian Thorne wrote that the Empire's downfall began not with violence, but with belief. The scholars who heard the whispers became convinced that the listener possessed knowledge capable of transforming civilization. They argued that the ancient builders had feared this knowledge because it challenged their understanding of reality itself. The listener, they claimed, was not a prisoner, but a teacher buried beneath the earth by fearful minds. Eventually, their influence reached members of the imperial court. The emperor himself authorized one final expedition into the deepest chambers beneath the capital. Cassian Thorne insisted on recording the event, fearing that history would otherwise forget what followed. The expedition descended through tunnels that had remained sealed for centuries. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The stone corridors were silent and empty, their ancient symbols staring back like watchful eyes carved into the rock. But the deeper they traveled, the stronger the whispers became. Soldiers guarding the scholars began hearing their own names spoken softly in the darkness ahead. Some claimed they saw faint lights moving far down the tunnels, lights that vanished whenever approached, yet the scholars pressed forward with growing excitement. According to the Chronicle, they eventually reached a chamber larger than any structure discovered before. At its center stood a colossal door carved from a single slab of black stone. The door's surface was covered in the same warning repeated thousands of times across the underground labyrinth. Do not, do not, answear, do not, open. Cassian Thorne's handwriting grew uneven as he described what happened next. The scholars believed the door was symbolic, a final test created by the ancient builders to frighten away the unworthy. They convinced the emperor's soldiers to break the stone seal that had held the door shut for ages beyond memory. And the moment that seal cracked, something on the other side answered. The moment the ancient seal fractured, the chamber did not explode with violence, nor did any monstrous form emerge from the darkness beyond the door. Instead, according to the Chronicle of Cassian Thorne, the first thing that happened was silence. A silence so complete that even the soldiers' breathing seemed to vanish within it. The torches along the chamber walls flickered faintly, their flames bending toward the crack in the stone door, as though drawn by a breath rising slowly from the depths beyond. For several seconds, nothing else occurred. Then one of the scholars began to laugh. Cassian wrote that the laughter was not joyful but astonished, like a man who had just discovered proof that the universe was far stranger than anyone had imagined. The scholar stepped closer to the fractured seal, pressing his ear against the narrow opening. When he pulled away, tears filled his eyes. He whispered that the voice was real. The listener in the deep was speaking. At first, the soldiers heard nothing. They stood in an easy formation while the scholars argued excitedly among themselves. But gradually, the atmosphere in the chamber began to change. Cassian described a sensation similar to standing at the edge of a vast canyon where distant echoes return long after a voice has faded. The sound was not loud. It was barely audible at all. Yet something about it felt deliberate. The whisper carried the rhythm of language even when no clear words could be distinguished. The scholars became entranced by it. One by one, they approached the door, leaning closer to hear what waited beyond the darkness. Soon, several of the soldiers began hearing fragments as well. A voice asking questions, a voice that sounded neither male nor female, neither young nor ancient. It spoke gently, patiently, as though it had been waiting for centuries for someone willing to listen. Cassian Thorne wrote that the questions were simple at first. Why do you fear what you do not understand? Why bury knowledge beneath stone instead of learning from it? Why did your ancestors believe the mind must remain small? The scholars answered aloud without realizing they had begun speaking. Their voices echoed across the vast chamber while the soldiers watched with growing unease. It felt less like a conversation and more like the slow unfolding of an idea that had been planted long ago. Within minutes, the scholars became convinced the ancient civilization had misunderstood the listener completely. They argued that the builders of the labyrinth had mistaken enlightenment for danger. The listener, they said, possessed knowledge older than human history. It understood the nature of time, memory, and the fragile architecture of the human mind. Cassian himself admitted that even he began feeling the pull of that argument. The voice did not threaten anyone. It did not demand worship or obedience. It simply offered answers. Yet the longer the soldiers remained in the chamber, the more uncomfortable they became. One captain later reported that he felt as though someone was quietly examining his thoughts, turning them slowly like pages in a book. Several guards suddenly stepped back from the door, claiming the whispers had begun speaking their childhood memories aloud. At that moment, the Emperor's lead scholar made a decision that would echo through the Empire's final days. He ordered the soldiers to widen the fractured seal. Cassian Thorne wrote that the captain hesitated only briefly before obeying. The Empire had sent them there to uncover the truth beneath the capital, and none of them yet believed they were standing at the edge of a disaster. The soldiers drove iron wedges into the ancient stone, hammering until the crack widened enough to reveal darkness beyond. No chamber lay behind the door. Instead, there was a descending tunnel, a narrow passage spiraling downward into depths that swallowed every trace of light. The whisper grew clearer the moment the passage opened. Cassian described the sound not as a voice speaking through air, but as a presence brushing against the edges of thought itself. Every person in the chamber heard something slightly different. Some heard philosophical questions about the origin of life. Others heard fragments of forgotten languages. A few soldiers later claimed they heard their own voices, repeating memories from years earlier. What terrified Cassian most was the realization that the listener seemed to understand each person individually. It did not speak one message to everyone. It tailored its whispers to whatever curiosity lived inside each mind. Within hours, the scholars insisted on descending into the tunnel. They argued that the listener could guide humanity toward discoveries that would transform civilization. The captain finally refused, claiming that no imperial order justified such a descent without further preparation. The scholars reacted with sudden anger. Cassian recorded that their eyes looked strangely distant, as though their thoughts were already focused far below the chamber floor. That night, the soldiers sealed the fractured door again and returned to the surface with Cassian's records. Yet the whispers did not remain underground. According to the Chronicle, several scholars began hearing the voice even after leaving the catacombs. It visited them in dreams, repeating the same patient questions that had echoed through the ancient chamber. Within weeks, those scholars began spreading their interpretations throughout the imperial court. They claimed the listener had been misunderstood by the ancient builders and that the empire now had a chance to unlock knowledge buried since the dawn of civilization. Cassian Thorne tried to warn the emperor that something about the whispers felt unnatural. But the scholars' enthusiasm had already taken root among the nobility. Secret gatherings formed where believers discussed the listener as though it were a philosopher imprisoned by fearful ancestors. Soon the empire split quietly into two factions. One believed the underground prison must remain sealed forever. The other believed the empire stood on the threshold of the greatest discovery in human history. Cassian wrote that the true catastrophe began when both factions realized the whispers were growing stronger. Citizens living far from the capital reported strange dreams about endless corridors carved beneath the earth. Merchants claimed they heard distant voices while traveling through mountain paths. Even children began speaking about a gentle voice, asking them curious questions during the night. The listener in the deep was no longer confined to the underground chamber. Somehow the moment the seal cracked, its whispers had begun spreading beyond the labyrinth itself. Within months, the empire descended into chaos. Scholars obsessed with the voice attempted to reopen the underground passage. Others organized militias to prevent them from reaching the catacombs again. Entire cities argued about whether the listener represented enlightenment or disaster. Cassian Thorne's Chronicle described the final moment when the emperor understood the truth. The whispers had never needed the door to be fully opened. The moment someone answered the questions, echoing through the darkness. The listener had already begun escaping into the minds of those willing to hear it. Cassian ended that section of the Chronicle with a single, chilling observation. The empire had not unleashed a monster from the depths. It had unleashed an idea, and ideas, once heard, can easily be buried again? Cassian Thorne wrote that once the empire understood what had truly been released, it was already far too late to return to silence. The whispers of the listener in the deep had traveled beyond the sealed chamber, beyond the catacombs, and into the fragile architecture of human thought itself. What began as a question in the darkness had become a presence, drifting quietly through the minds of thousands. At first, the empire attempted to deny it. Imperial officials dismissed reports of strange dreams and murmured voices as superstitions spreading among frightened citizens. But denial could not stop what had already begun. Cassian described the slow transformation of the empire, not as a violent collapse, but as a gradual unraveling of certainty. Scholars who once debated mathematics and philosophy began arguing about the meaning of the questions whispered in their sleep. Merchants traveling across distant provinces reported hearing fragments of the same gentle voice echoing through empty roads at night. Priests found their sermons interrupted by followers who claimed the listener asked more profound questions than any scripture could answer. The most terrifying detail in Cassian's Chronicle was the realization that the listener never issued commands. It never demanded loyalty or obedience. It simply asked questions that quietly reshaped the thoughts of those who listened. Questions about the limits of knowledge. Questions about whether reality itself was only a narrow fragment of something much larger waiting to be understood. Cassian confessed that even he began hearing the whispers while writing the Chronicle. At first he resisted them, reminding himself that curiosity had already destroyed one civilization. Yet the voice never threatened him. It never argued. It only asked why fear should determine the boundaries of human understanding. That single question haunted him more than any threat could have. The Emperor eventually issued the most desperate decree in the Empire's history. Every entrance to the underground labyrinth beneath the capital was to be sealed with stone and iron. All records describing the listener were to be destroyed. Anyone claiming to hear the whispers would be removed from public life and confined to isolated monasteries. The Empire believed that if knowledge of the listener vanished, the whispers themselves might fade. Cassian Thorne was among the few archivists ordered to preserve one final record before the purge began. His chronicle was meant to explain the Empire's downfall to future generations who might discover the ruins centuries later. Yet even as he wrote the final chapters, Cassian realized the Emperor's decree misunderstood the true nature of the catastrophe. The listener did not require open tunnels or ancient chambers to reach human minds. It required only awareness. The moment someone understood the possibility that such a presence existed, the questions could begin again. Cassian recorded how entire cities slowly abandoned reason as philosophers and scholars debated the meaning of the whispers. Some believed the listener represented a new form of intelligence older than humanity itself. Others insisted it was merely a psychological echo created by the fear of ancient warnings. But while the Empire argued, the whispers grew stronger. Farmers reported hearing voices drifting through empty fields at night. Soldiers guarding distant borders claimed their thoughts felt crowded by ideas that did not belong to them. The Empire's final years became a storm of confusion and obsession. Cassian wrote that libraries burned as officials attempted to erase every trace of the listener from history. Scholars who refused to abandon their research vanished quietly into exile. The capital itself grew strangely quiet as citizens avoided discussing the whispers even when they knew their neighbors heard the same questions in the darkness. Then came the final disaster. Cassian described a night when the entire city awoke simultaneously from the same dream. Tens of thousands of people claimed they had heard the listener ask one final question, echoing across the Empire's sleeping minds. What would humanity become if it no longer feared the unknown? The next morning, riots erupted across the capital. Some citizens demanded the underground labyrinth be reopened so the listener could share its knowledge freely. Others believed the only way to save civilization was to destroy the catacombs entirely and collapse the ancient prison forever. Within days, the Empire descended into chaos beyond repair. Cassian ended his chronicle with the fall of the capital itself, though even he admitted he never fully understood how the destruction unfolded. Fires consumed entire districts. Armies meant to defend the Empire turned against one another in confusion and desperation. By the time the chaos ended, the civilization that had once ruled the region for centuries simply ceased to exist. Survivors fled across distant lands, carrying fragments of memory, but almost no written record of what had happened. Only a handful of archivists preserved the truth. Cassian Thorne wrote his final words while preparing to seal the chronicle within a chest that would be hidden, far from the ruins of the fallen empire. He explained that the purpose of the record was not to reveal the listener as secrets, but to warn future generations about the danger of curiosity without caution. The ancient civilization had buried the prison because they believed the listener's whispers could reshape the human mind. The Empire had ignored that warning and paid the price. Cassian's final line was written with ink so dark it seemed almost carved into the page. He warned that the listener in the deep could never truly be imprisoned again once its existence had been remembered. Knowledge itself had become the open door. Elias Varen finished reading those final words in the cold chamber beneath the monastery of St. Armand. For a long moment, neither he nor Brother Matthew spoke. The silence felt heavy with centuries of forgotten fear. Finally, Elias closed the chronicle and asked the question that had haunted him since the chest was opened. If the listener's influence spread through knowledge alone, then why protect the chronicle for 400 years instead of destroying it? Brother Matthew looked toward the lantern flame as though searching its small circle of light for courage, because the monks eventually realized something even more unsettling than the listener itself. The whispers never spread everywhere at once. They appeared only where someone became curious enough to search for the truth buried in the past. The chronicle had been guarded because it served as both a warning and a test. Anyone who read it and dismissed the story as myth would walk away unchanged. But anyone who finished the chronicle and felt a spark of curiosity about the listener might already be hearing the first quiet question forming somewhere in their own thoughts. Elias Varen stood slowly, the weight of the manuscript still lingering in his hands. Somewhere deep within the monastery walls, the winter wind whispered faintly through narrow corridors of stone. and for a brief moment, Elias wondered whether that sound truly belonged to the wind at all. Thank you for listening to this hidden chapter of forgotten history here on the Unveiled Scroll. If this story stirred your curiosity about the mysteries buried beneath time, remember to like, subscribe, and share the channel so more explorers of history can uncover these shadows together. And if you wish to continue walking through the darker corridors of the past, another story awaits you just beyond this video, where the next sealed scroll is ready to be opened. Farewell for now, and until the next chronicle is revealed, listen carefully to the silence between the pages of history.